Hey guys, how's it going? It's Jay, and today I'm going to review the Canon R10. Now, this is not going to be a quick review because I'm also going to show you how to use the camera in detail, and that takes time. So, with that being said, I have navigation links below in the description area so you guys can navigate to specifically what you're looking for if you want to skip around. Also, I just want to give a quick thank you to BH Photo for letting me borrow the Canon R10 and the kit lenses. Thanks a lot, BH Photo, and links below, guys, if you want to check them out. I really appreciate the support. So, the R10 is Canon's entry-level RF mount aps-c mirrorless camera that goes for about $980 US at the time of this review. Based on the R10's main feature set and price point, its direct competition would be, in my opinion anyway, the Sony a6400, the Nikon Z50, and the Fuji S10. So the Canon R10's key features which stand out to me are the built-in viewfinder, which is particularly awesome for photography and or tracking moving subjects in bright conditions. Think about sports. It's also easier to hold the camera stable when it's held up to your eye. So you can get sharper shots at lower shutter speeds as well. The R10 has a 15 frames per second mechanical shutter, which is the best in class and killer for those high-speed subject captures without any of that rolling shutter that can happen when using electronic shutters at higher speeds. It can also help with flicker and banding issues in weird lighting scenarios like fluorescent lights and stuff like that inside gymnasiums is what comes to my mind. So to complement the 15 frames per second mechanical shutter, the R10 also has the latest and greatest autofocus technology, such as subject tracking for humans and animals, IAF for humans and animals, tons of focus area options. You can also dial in autofocus speed and sensitivity for video, which is powerful. A few other key features worth mentioning are the built-in time-lapse HDR technology. Of course, it does 4K video. It does 4K 60. It's cropped a little bit, but great feature. Has high frame rate mode, which is 120 frames per second for slow motion video. Now for this review, I used the RFS 18 to 45 millimeter kit lens, and I also used the 18 to 150 millimeter kit lens. Now, these are the only two RFS lens options that Canon offers at this time. So there are other full frame RF lenses you can get, which are a lot larger, a lot more money. Now, I did test out both these lenses in great detail, and you can check out that video up here. But to just sum that up, the 18 to 150 is definitely the better lens to get in my opinion. It is a little bit larger and heavier, but it's pretty much better in every way. It's sharper, it has less distortion, has a faster f3.5 max aperture, has a way more versatile range, and it has significantly more magnification, which means you can get closer to stuff and get blurrier backgrounds. So if you can afford it, I would highly recommend spending the extra money and going with the 18 to 150 millimeter kit lens, at least at this time, because those are the only two lens options that are specific for this camera. All right, let's go over this camera body and I'll discuss more features and how to use the camera as we go along. All right, so looking at the camera body, you can see here, it's like a mini DSLR type camera body design, which reminds me of the Rebel XTI I used to have back in the day. So I really love the ergonomics on this camera, and with the two lightweight kit lenses I used for this review, it was a balanced match. All right, guys, so underneath this body cap here, just gotta unscrew that, we have a 24 megapixel aps-c sensor. Now, this sensor has 651 autofocus points embedded in there, so that's incredible, covers pretty much the entire sensor. Now, let me just mount up a lens here. I'm gonna mount up the 18 to 45 millimeter because it's just a little bit smaller and lighter to use for this demonstration here. And that's what it looks like with the lens mounted. So listen, if you guys want to get up and running really quick, just be sure to check out my quick start guide for this camera, and that'll get you up and running really fast. But anyways, when you put the lens on, you do have to line up this red dot with the red dash on the lens. You just place it in there like so, and then twist it, and you will hear it lock into place. To take the lens off, you just have to hit this button right here. That's the lens release button. That'll allow you, if you press that, to unscrew the lens. Now to use this lens, you have to actually expand it first. So right there is when the lens is in its usable range. When you stow the camera, you can actually compact the lens down like so. And that is a cool feature about this particular lens. It makes the overall package a little smaller when not in use. So we also have a neck strap for this camera. I didn't put the neck strap on because I just don't really like these neck straps, honestly, and I also wanted to use this on a gimbal, so I didn't bother using the neck strap, but that's what these two little loops are for. That's for the neck strap, so you can put that on there and hang the camera around your neck and stuff. Now looking at the top of the camera, we have an on and off switch here, so you can just switch that toggle. That'll turn the camera on and off. We have a dial here to adjust settings. We have another main dial here to adjust settings. Have a multi-function button there right in front of the dial. And then of course here we have the shutter button. Now this is a 2-stage button. So you press it halfway to focus, and when you press it all the way, it will take the photo. Then we have a video record button here that'll start recording video. It doesn't really matter what mode you're in, it will start recording pretty much in all the modes if you hit that button, but there is a dedicated video mode as well. Now, of course, the mode dial, you have all these different modes. I have a video dedicated to the different modes on this camera, guys, so if you want to see how every mode individually works, be sure to check out that video. I will have that linked up here. Now, we also have a lock button here, which is kind of cool. Now, when you hit the lock button by accident, it might be frustrating, but when you hand the camera to somebody, or if you were accidentally making changes and you're messing up, you can just hit this lock button and the camera's settings will kind of be locked in place. So you can just hand the camera to somebody that doesn't know what they're doing, and all they have to do is press the shutter button, and you don't have to worry about them changing settings on you. Now, let me just show you here on the front, we have this autofocus toggle. So there's a little toggle switch here, so you can switch it from manual focus to autofocus. And then in the center, there's a button. Now that button is a depth of field preview. All right, so looking at the back, we have a lot of other buttons here. We have the menu button over here. That'll get you into the menu. And the menu is actually different depending on what mode you're in. When you're in full auto mode, scene mode, and the filter mode, you get like a more simplistic menu. When you're in video mode, you get pretty much the main menu, except there's just a couple of things are different. All the other settings, you get the full menu. So just remember that the menu is different depending on what mode you're in. Now, looking at the back again, we have the viewfinder here. Now, this is a really nice viewfinder. It looks really good when you look through it. Now, underneath the viewfinder is the adjustment here if you need to adjust that for your vision. I had to adjust it for mine. It was blurry when it was at default. So you just slide that left and right until it, marries up with what looks good to you. Now we also have a joystick on the back here that you can use to move the focus area around. You can also use it to navigate in the menus. It's really awesome. It's 8-way direction here. You have an AF on button. Now this button is like back button focus. It basically works exactly the same as when you press the shutter down halfway. You just press that and it'll focus for you. Now over here you have the auto exposure lock. That's what this star button does. It'll just lock the exposure at a given value for a given period of time, depending on how you have it set in the menu. This is the autofocus area button, and it also works as a zoom, as you could see here. Then, of course, we have the info button, which will change what the screen looks like. And then you have another pad here with different options. You have flash, ISO, and you have drive modes there. And then you have the Q button and a set button in the center. So that's also like the enter button, the set button. Then down here you have the playback menu, which is where you can go to view your photos and videos and stuff like that. Now, looking at the bottom of the camera, I just wanted to show you, here's the tripod mount, or, the bracket thread, whatever. It's a quarter thread there, so you can put your tripod plate, or you can screw a little mini tripod right in there. Now, in here, you have your battery and your memory card. So here is the battery. This is what the battery looks like. So when it comes to battery life, this little battery is not really that good. It's decent, but it's very similar to the Sony cameras with the smaller batteries. So you're gonna definitely need to get a couple of these, at least one spare battery I'd recommend getting. And it goes in this way. And it just locks into place with this little lever here. And it also comes with the battery charger. So you can charge your battery in this charger here, and this just plugs right into the wall. Very easy to use. Or you can also charge it by the USB ports on the side. I'll show you that in a second. But I just want to show you the memory card first. So the memory card goes in here, and if you click it, push down on it, it'll like click and pop out. So as far as memory cards go, this is the one that I prefer. It's a UHS-2 card. There's a lot of good cards out there these days, but the faster UHS-2 cards, they just write faster and read faster, and it'll clear that buffer faster on the Canon R10 in particular. So if you're a sports shooter, highly recommend getting a UHS-2 card so it clears that buffer for you. Now, the camera does not work when the battery door is open, so I don't know if dummy batteries are going to work in this camera unless there's some kind of workaround, because I don't see a notch anywhere for the cable to come through. but you have to have the door closed in order for the battery to work, and it does automatically lock, which is really nice, and I wish the Sony cameras did that. But the Sony cameras do allow you to leave the door open and use the camera, which will solve the battery blank issue if you want to use a dummy battery. So it's possible there's an option somewhere in the camera, but I looked in depth for it and I could not find that option. So I think that's just one of those things with this camera that you got to deal with. All right, so again, now looking at the back, I just wanted to show you this awesome screen here that rotates, as you can see here, rotates all around, so you can put it in all these different options. You can spin it like this and have it so the screen's facing out, or like I showed you a second ago, you can have it in like this more protective mode, so when you put it in your bag, you don't have to worry about scratching the screen. Highly recommend doing that with this camera. Just whenever you put it away, just put it in this armor mode, and it'll just protect your screen when it's like bouncing around in your camera bag, you know? Sometimes something in your camera bag might come loose and rub against the screen while you're walking. This will prevent that damage, you know what I'm saying? All right, guys, looking at the side, here's where the port doors are. And it's got these rubber doors, which are quite nice, actually. All right, so here we have the micro HDMI, if you want to output video. And here we have a USB-C port where you can charge the camera. So you can just plug a cable into that, leave the battery in the camera, and the camera will start charging the battery. So you don't have to use the standalone charger if you don't want to. And then underneath here, we have another door here. We have a microphone jack right there. If you want to use an on-camera mic, you can just plug it in right there, get way better audio. And then this other port is for a remote control. All right, so then we have the hot shoe up here, and we have the stereo mic ports right there. This is a speaker right there. That's where the audio comes out. So you can measure from there if you need to measure from the actual sensor plane. That's what that little icon is for. The other thing here is this AF illuminator that will light up in low light conditions to help the autofocus and stuff like that. And it's also a countdown timer. All right, guys, let's boot this camera up here. Let me just open the screen, aim the screen up like that. And now, if I turn this toggle switch right here, you can see the camera is now on. So it's telling me, set the lens to shooting position. See how that comes up? You remember how I told you earlier how this lens has to be put into the right position, like it's gotta be opened? So here is the shooting position. Now I just got to take the lens cap off so we can see. I have it in full auto mode and it's bringing up this menu. To apply effects, press the Creative Assist button. So I'm just going to click hide. If you're new and you're a beginner, then you can use these things in full auto mode and that'll allow you to make some changes and stuff. I'm just going to hit this button here to hide that and click OK. So here we are looking at, you know, just the camera, and I got a little test chart in front here. One other thing I wanted to mention is just how good this LCD screen looks like, especially when compared to the Sony cameras. Even the really high, expensive Sony cameras don't have good screens. I don't know why, but Canon is putting a much higher quality screen on their cameras than Sony is. So definitely worth noting. I can tell you for sure that this LCD screen looks way better than my Sony a6400 or the Sony ZV-E10 or my Sony a7C for that matter. So the first thing we're going to do is hit the menu button. I'm in full auto, and if you look at the menu here, notice how the menu is kind of like limited. It doesn't have like, it's not filled out all the way. So you have a lot of options in here, but way less options than you do when you go to some of the other modes, like let's go to shutter priority mode, which is the TV mode here. Now if I hit the menu button, see how the menu has way more options in there? So it's significantly different. Now if I go to video mode and hit the menu button, this is also a little bit different. See how the numbers stop at 7? So there's 3 different menus in here, just so you're aware, and you need to know that because you might be looking for a certain setting and you can't find it and you're like, where is it? I don't understand. So keep that in mind, all right, guys? And again, like I was saying earlier, let me put it into full auto mode again. So just to take a photo, all I'm doing, I'm pressing the shutter halfway and it's focusing. Hit the button again and it took the photo. So that's just basic operation. Now, if I go into scene mode here, scene mode is pretty cool. Full auto is just, it does all the thinking for you. Point and shoot, hit record if you want to record. Scene mode, if you go in here, you can choose your different scene. And the reason why I wanted to show you this is because it's not just for beginners that don't know how to use the camera. There's a couple of features in here that are really cool features that this is the only place to get to them. One of them is the panoramic shot mode, and you can see a sample photo that I took here. And then, of course, if you guys are in a specific scene, you can select that scene here and the camera will just dial in those settings for you. Now, there's other modes in here, close-up, food, night portrait and stuff, which we'll use the on-camera flash. By the way, guys, to use the flash, you just have to lift up on this thing and that'll show you the flash. That's the flash right there. I forgot to show you that, sorry. So then another option I wanted to show you here was this option here, silent shutter. If you guys are in a situation where you need the camera to be silent, just put it in scene mode, go to silent right there, and you don't have to worry about nothing. Your camera's now in silent mode. Now, creative filters, this is where you can go and just choose different filters, black and white, blurry, you know, fisheye effects and things like that. But if we go into like aperture priority mode, which is one of the modes I use most often on cameras, this is what the camera looks like. And the default view of the screen looks like that. But if you hit the info button on the back of the camera, which is right here where my thumb is, you can change the way the screen looks. And now you can see there's way more information. And if you cycle through, now you have the histogram there, which is really cool. So you can see the brightness and the darkness and stuff like that. And then if you hit the info button again, this is no information, so you just get the raw screen data. And then here is another spot where you can see all different settings. I like this option here because it has the auto leveler. You see that leveler there, the orange bars, and they turn green when you have it level. Let me hit the info button. We'll get it back to this mode. Let me just switch the camera to manual mode here. So now the camera's in manual exposure mode, and if you want to set everything manually, this is where you would need to go. Now, to get to the ISO, there's 3 different ways you can get there with this camera. This camera is super easy to use. All right, so if you want to go to ISO, you have a button right here on the bottom for ISO. You can just select that, and now you can click and drag if you want, or you can just click around to change your ISO. So I'm just going to put it on auto for now, and if you could hit back here like that. Now you can also get to the ISO by hitting this MFN button, which is the multifunction button. If you click that, it brings up this menu. And now if you change this dial, it'll actually make the adjustment on whatever option you're on. If you hit this dial, it'll cycle through the different options. So again, here's ISO. You also have your drive mode here, so you can change that. Right here you have high speed plus, high speed, and then you have regular high speed. You have self timer here. In addition to that, on the back of the camera, you have another ISO button right here on the top of the pad. So if you hit ISO, it'll bring you into ISO as well. So there's the 3 different ways you can get to ISO on this camera. All right, so I'm gonna hard set the ISO to 100, like so. And now if I just turn this dial, you could see how I'm adjusting the shutter speed, and you can see the meter adjusting. That's the meter in the center there. So right there is a good exposure. So this one is controlling shutter speed by default, and this dial is controlling aperture by default. You can see the aperture changing right there. That's the F number. So that's how that works just by default. So in manual mode, shutter speed, aperture, and then ISO, you can get to it with this button, the multifunction button, or you can get to it with the ISO button on the back, or you can get to it by just touching right there. Now, of course, like I said, you could just hit record at any time and it'll start recording. But you can also go into the video record menu, movie recording, and choose your mode. Now you have a full auto mode here, so this will pretty much do all the thinking for you. You have a manual video mode, which is what I use, and then you have HDR. Now HDR will just help with the highlights and stuff like that, but from the reading that I've done, it seems like that's really more for HDR displays. Like if you have an HDR TV or an HDR monitor and you're trying to create content specific for that device, I think you'd be better off playing around with the HDR options, because I took sample video and stuff with the HDR, and on my monitor, it just doesn't look that good. It's like you could tell that it's made for something else, and that's just my experience with it. Just went back to manual there. What I also want to show you here is when I'm in video mode, notice how there's a record button there, so you can just hit that button to start recording, or you can hit this button, of course, and then you have your Q menu, and notice how the Q menu is different for video. Over here you have white balance and a couple other features. This little option here with the guy is your subject detect mode. So I have it set for humans, but you can set it for animals, you could set it for vehicles, or you can just turn that off, which is pretty sweet as well if you don't want it to pick up any of that stuff. Now I'm just gonna switch it back to aperture priority mode here. All right, guys, to enable touch shutter, see this little button right there? It looks like a truck. It's hard to see. It's this little button above the magnifying glass. If you hit that button there, that turns touch shutter on. And now, if you just touch around, the camera will take the shot. It'll automatically focus and it'll automatically take the photo, as you can see there. Let's hit the back button. To cancel that, you just have to press that button again. Now it's turned off. All right, so going back into the Q menu, here's your different focus options on the bottom. All right, so notice I have AF area selected. On the bottom are your different AF options. So here's the spot AF, here's 1-point AF, here's expand AF area. So I'll show you what this looks like. Let me just press in the center. So you can see it looks like a box with those 4 little AF points, so it will expand a little bit past that box. That's what that means. And now if we go to this one, this is expand AF area around, and you can see there's more spots around. I recommend using this option for sports because if you're tracking moving subjects, you're going to try to keep them in the center of the frame most of the time, and this will expand a little bit. And check it out, if you want that to go into the dead center of the frame, there's a button up here that'll reset it. See how it just went back into the center? And now I could just touch over here to move it. And if I want to get it back to the center, all I got to do is hit that button and it'll go right back to the center. Another thing you can do is if you hit this button right here, this is the AF area button. So if you hit that button, you see how this menu changes on the bottom? Now you can turn the dials and you could move the focus point just horizontally. So you don't have to worry about it going all awkward. Or you can turn this dial here and it'll move up and down. And guys, don't forget you have this joystick here. You can just use the joystick to move this around as well. There's so many different ways. And then again, just to get it back to center, you can hit that button and the AF will go right back to the center. Now, if we go back into the Q menu, you can see all these other options you have. So you have white balance. Here's your different white balance settings. You have auto white balance, which works really well on this camera. But if you're out in sunny conditions, you can change it to sunny. And if you know your lighting temperature and stuff like that, you can select your Kelvin and dial in the temperature. So I usually do that in the studio because my lights are a specific color temperature. Also in the Q menu here, we have metering mode right there. If we go in here, you have your different metering modes. Now, average metering is what the camera's on by default, but you can change it to center and spot metering if you want. And that just controls how the camera determines how bright the scene is. So by default, the camera's using the entire screen, that's average metering. But if you put it to like center average, it kind of works like where the autofocus area points are, and it'll only meter for like the center area. And then spot metering will only meter for that one specific spot. So it's great for, you know, tough situations if you're like taking a photo of a light bulb or like really bright water or like a bright wedding dress in the sun. Things like that. You can use those metering modes to help dial in the exposure easier. It's just another tool. And then here you have the aspect ratio. So if you want to shoot default, that's 3:2. If you want to square, that would be 1:1 here, for example. So guys, another option I wanted to show you is this zoom. You see the magnifying glass there? You can click on that and it'll zoom in for you. How cool is that? So you can just check the focus. You hit the zoom again, it'll go to 10 times. And if you hit it again, it goes away. So that zoom option is right there for you, and it's really helpful to check focus if you're nervous that it's focusing on the wrong thing or something like that. You can go in there and just hit the zoom and check it. Great for manual focus as well. All right, so let's just say we wanted to take sports photos. Let me show you how I would set this camera up for sports really quick. First thing I would do is I would put it in shutter priority mode, like that. I would dial it to 1/500th of a second. That's where it is right now. I would use that autofocus mode that I told you guys about, the autofocus around mode. So if you go to Q, you go to the AF option on the top. This is the autofocus around mode. So I would select that. I would also, instead of going to one shot, I would change it to servo mode so it constantly focuses. So the servo is like live autofocus. It'll just keep autofocusing the entire time and tracking your subjects. I would also make sure you have the subject tracked to humans, assuming that you're tracking an athlete of some sort. And then now as far as image quality goes, if you go in here, you can go to RAW or RAW plus JPEG. I have it set to RAW quality, but the problem with RAW quality is the buffer fills up really quick. So let me just change the drive mode here. Now if I hit the multi-function here, I can scroll over right here, and now I can go to, I'm going to go to high plus. So that is the fastest 15 frames per second option right there. So I'm in high plus mode. Now ISO, I'm going to go into ISO. I'm going to change that to auto. So this way the ISO will just go to whatever it has to get that 1/500th of a second shutter speed. So I have the autofocus set, I have the ISO set, I have the shutter speed set, and the camera is pretty much going to do all the other thinking for me. Now what I want to show you is how fast the buffer fills up. So if you're in rapid fire mode, check this out. See that? The buffer filled up that quick. And it's writing to the card, doing the best it can. Now, if I was using the UHS-2 card, it would write faster and clear that buffer, but it still fills up very quick. So watch what happens when I change the quality to JPEG. So if I go into menu here, let me just go to page 1, image quality. So let me turn off RAW, and I'll turn on JPEG at like medium quality there. See that I have it on large medium? So, and then I'm just going to click OK. So now if I go to take a shot, watch how long it'll go before the buffer fills up. See what I mean? That's a huge difference. So if you guys are shooting sports and you don't need raw quality, and you're having a hard time because the buffer keeps filling up on you and it's driving you crazy, you can switch the camera to JPEG mode or just use it in JPEG mode, whatever. But that lower quality JPEG is still really good quality, and you can get a way better, sports session, let's say, with rapid fire without that buffer bogging out on you. So just keep that in mind, all right? Now, once you have the camera dialed in exactly how you want, the only other setting that I would recommend changing is the white balance, but I wouldn't change that just yet because you don't know what conditions you're going to be in when you're shooting sports. So I have the camera all set up for sports, right? So watch this. Go to menu. Now, if you go up, if you hit the info button on the back of the camera, it will cycle through the top of the menu. So I want to go to the one that looks like the wrench, and then I'm going to go over to the right, and notice where it says custom shoot mode C1, C2. I'm going to go in there, and I'm going to go register settings, and then I'm going to say custom shooting mode C1. Yep, that's what I want to do. Click OK. And now it just loaded it. So now on the mode dial up here, we have a custom 1. See that? Custom 1, shutter priority. So now the camera is just set up for sports. Like just by turning it to C1, I have it like dialed in for my settings for sports, let's say. Really cool feature. Highly recommend doing that for sports and whatever else you guys shoot. If you don't shoot sports, then set it for landscapes or whatever. But you can program it to your dial here so you can just get to those preferred settings really quick. Let's say I want to take a portrait or something, right? I go into aperture priority mode, and now this is still set up for like a lot of the sports settings that I had. So I have to go into the Q menu here. I want to take it off servo. I don't want it on servo mode for that purpose. That's just what I prefer. I like doing one shot when I'm doing stuff like that. And then I want it set for raw mode, so I can go in here and I could switch to raw quality, go back, and I can turn JPEG off. So now I'm only shooting in raw quality. AF area, I'm just going to put that to whole area AF because if it sees a human, it's going to automatically select the eye on the human anyway, so I'm just going to select it for that. So now I have the camera dialed in for like portraits. So I'm going to go into the menu, not necessarily portraits, but just like default settings. I could use this for landscapes even too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the menu, I'm going to go to custom config, register settings, and go to C2. Click OK. There we have it. So now I can just put the camera in C2, and that's going to get me, pretty much 90% of the way there if I want to take a portrait or a landscape. All I really got to do is dial in the aperture, for example. That's just the basic operation of how this camera works. And again, using these custom modes can really help speed up your workflow. So I wanted to spend a little time showing you that. All right, so I'm just going to put the camera into aperture priority mode, and we are going to go check out the menu here. All right, so if we go into the menu here, we got the main tabs on the top. And like I said earlier, if you hit the info button, it'll cycle through the main tabs. Now, if you turn the dial, it's going to cycle through the sub tabs. And if you turn the other dial, it's going to cycle through the menu items themselves, as you can see. So here on page 1, we have image quality right here. So this is where you can select RAW or JPEG, for example. So if you want to shoot JPEG quality and not RAW, you can just go like that. Now I have RAW turned off and JPEG turned on. If you want RAW plus JPEG, you can do it like that. Now I have RAW and JPEG turned on. So if you're shooting RAW and you also want JPEG but don't necessarily need that high resolution one, you can just switch it to like medium or something like that. So now you have a smaller, lower resolution JPEG file and then the full quality RAW file. Now compressed RAW is going to be your best quality option, just so you're aware, but some of the camera features get grayed out when you use compressed RAW, just so you know. Not that big of a deal, but worth noting. So this is how I normally have it set up though. I prefer to shoot RAW and I like to edit my photos in Lightroom. I'm just going to hit the OK button to set that. You have dual pixel RAW, which is an advanced feature, pretty cool. It looks like you have to use the Canon software though to manipulate the photos when you use that mode. So I'm just gonna go through and I wanted to show you a couple of settings that I like changing in here, but I'm not gonna go through the entire menu system, it's just too vast. So anyways, what we have here is exposure comp. So if we go in here, this is where you can set bracketing. So I'm just hitting this set button on the center dial to go in that menu. And now if we turn the dial here, you see how those bars are coming out? Those are the bracketing options. So I just set this up to take 3 exposures. It's going to take -2, 0, and +2. And I can hit set to set that. So now if I just take 3 shots, it took all 3 shots. So if I go into the playback menu, so here's the regular exposure, here's the -2, and here's the +2. So those are the shots I just took using the bracketing mode. And now that I'm in the menu here, you can do a bunch of different stuff. You see the magnifying glass over here, you can click that to zoom in. You could use the joystick to move around. You can use this dial on the top now to zoom in and out. And you can go way back, like, because I have tons of photos here because I was doing rapid fire. You can actually scroll through. Now, you can also pinch to zoom and then double click to tap on the photo and then pinch to zoom in. Then move around with the joystick, or you can click and drag and move around. Super versatile, this camera. So many different ways to do everything. It's amazing, it really is. Awesome user interface design on this camera. I think it's much better than the Sony's for sure in that regard. But anyways, back into the menu system here, that's where you can do bracketing if you want to take HDR photos. Now, if you do bracketing like that, I recommend having the self-timer set. So if you want to set the self-timer, you can go and just press the shutter button to go back to the main shooting area. And if you hit left here on this pad, that's where you can go into your drive modes. Now, I recommend setting the self-timer for like 2 seconds or so for HDR, because normally what you do is you have the camera on a tripod, you'll hit the shutter button, then you let go of the camera, and then it'll go beep, beep, and then fire the 3 shots, and you'll get tack sharp shots because, you know, you weren't touching the camera, like hitting the shutter button, for example. So that's how that works if you're an HDR shooter. I'm just going to put it back and then hit OK. So now that's back to where it was. Now here we have ISO settings. So if we go in here, this is where you can control your ISO settings. So you have ISO speed, it's set to auto right now. You have your range right here. So if you go in here, you can select your range. Now, if you click on the 32,000, it actually goes up to 51,200. Now, you might not want to use that, but that's how you would get to your maximum ISO. And if I just click OK there, now you can see the ISO range goes from 100 all the way up to high, which is the 51,000. Now you also have an auto range here. So this is cool. You can still have your ISO set to high there, but then when you're using auto ISO, you can dial that in separately. So you can like lower this, for example. Put that down to like 12,800. Click OK. So now auto ISO will be within that range. However, if you just want to hard set the ISO, you can go above that if you want. Now this feature right here is awesome. Minimum shutter speed. It's set to auto right now. If you're hand holding and the shutter speed is too slow and you have it in auto ISO, this is where you can go to speed that up. For example, like right now, if I go to take a picture, it's putting the shutter speed at 1/60th of a second or 1/80th of a second. See that? That's the shutter speed right there. So if I go back to that setting and instead of going to auto, I I've turned the dial and I put it on faster, auto 3, and then I'll click the set button here. And now when I go to focus, see how the shutter speed is at 1/640th of a second, 1/500th of a second, and you can see it's maxing out the ISO, which I currently have auto set and maxed out at 12,800. So that's what that minimum shutter speed feature does. This is awesome if you're using aperture priority mode and you're shooting sports, for example, and you need a minimum shutter of like 1/500th of a second or whatever the case may be. If you're just hand holding and you have a shaky hand, you might need to raise this up. Now, I wouldn't raise it up to maximum like that necessarily, but you can put it here, like on auto 1, for example. And now if I focus, notice how it's at like 1/125th of a second, 1/60th of a second. So that's not going to jack up your ISO too much, but it's going to give you a sharper shot if you have a little bit of a shaky hand at 1/60th of a second, let's say, which is kind of where default is as far as the shutter goes. Now that's how the auto range works. So I'm just going to put that back to 0. But if you guys go down to manual, check this out. Now you just have these manual settings, which is fantastic. So you can go through here and just put the camera at like 1/500th of a second, like I recommended earlier for sports. And now the minimum shutter speed will be set to 1/500th of a second, even though I'm in aperture priority mode, as you can see here, the AV. And the reason why it's not going to 500, by the way, is because my ISO can only go so high. So it is at 1/500th of a second right now. But if it doesn't go to that, that's because the ISO, the auto ISO maximum could be causing a limitation there. So keep that in mind. You might have to raise your maximum ISO to get that max minimum shutter speed. All right, so I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to put it back to auto. And then I'm going to put it back to 0. But let me just show you if I lower it to auto -2. So see how the shutter speed is at 1/15th of a second now? So if you're using a tripod or something, you could set it like this because you don't have to worry about camera shake, for example. That's what that feature does. I wanted to explain that in detail because it's a very powerful feature, and I recommend using it, especially if you're getting blurry shots. Like if you're taking photos and you're getting blurry shots, it's probably because your shutter speed is too slow. And this is where you can go to fix that. All right. Hope that helps you guys out. All right, so now we have this HDR mode. This is really cool because this is like auto HDR on Sony cameras pretty much. And if you go in here, you can enable HDR. So you can set it to auto or you can set your EVs. So I'm just gonna put it to like 2 EVs. And now continuous HDR, that's if you want it to continue. If you want to just leave it in auto HDR throughout your shooting session, you would have it set to every shot. If you just want to take one auto HDR, you would just want it set to have it one shot only. So I'm going to leave it on every shot for now. Auto image alignment. So what it's going to do, it's going to take multiple shots and then it's going to blend those shots together and align them for you. So I recommend having that on, enable that. Then save to memory card. Now you can have it save all the images, or you can have it just save the composite that the camera creates for you. That's how I like to have it set for the most part, but all images, you'd be a little bit safer that way because you would get the HDR and you would get the images as well if you want to just, play with the regular exposure and not the HDR. So that's what those features are for. And it works really good. I used it. I did a couple test photos with that feature and I was pretty happy with how it worked. All right, so going back into the menu here, I'm going to scroll through and show a couple other features. But like I said, I'm not going to go into all these different options here because there is just so many options on this camera. It's incredible. So lens correction, I would go in here. I recommend turning that stuff on. That'll help, just fix lens flaws. Now I'm using kit lenses, so they're not going to be as good as the pro lenses. So I would recommend having these options on if they're available. You got lens optimizer here, which is pretty cool. So you can set that to high, standard, or you can just disable it altogether. So standard seems to work pretty good. That's what that feature does. All right, so you have high ISO speed noise reduction. If you're doing astrophotography, I would recommend turning this off. By default, this is just letting you know how much noise reduction is going to be applied to images when you take them. And it does kind of get muddy when you have higher ISOs. with the noise reduction on, but it does clean up the noise. So it's kind of like a love-hate situation with the noise reduction. I just left it on standard. It works pretty good. Now, if you keep going over here, we've got multiple exposures, raw burst mode, focus bracketing. Here's your drive modes. Interval timer. Now, interval timer, this is where you would set up the camera for time lapse. So if you want to take a series of photos for time-lapse photography, this is where you would go about doing that. And you can change the number of settings and all sorts of stuff in here by selecting that. Click OK. I'm just going to turn that off though. I'm going to disable it. But that's where interval shooting is, which is time-lapse. Now here's silent shutter function. This is where you can turn that on. Shutter mode, it's set to electronic, but we have mechanical as well. I recommend putting mechanical on there. If you want the best quality for sports and high-speed shooting, I recommend having it on mechanical shutter mode. Release shutter without card. Now that just means you can take a photo without having a memory card in there. Touch shutter, you can turn that on and off here. Image review. Now when you take a photo, the image will come up for 2 seconds by default. You can turn that off right here if you don't like that. I've left it on this camera, but I normally have that turned off because it drives me crazy, to be honest, when I'm trying to take photos and I have to wait. But that's where you can go and you can change that. Now, display simulation. This is an important feature I wanted to show you guys. If you go in here, I have this set for exposure and depth of field. So when you change the aperture, the camera will actually show you what the depth of field looks like. So it's a live view mode, basically. And that's how the Sony cameras work by default. And I recommend setting it like that. By default, it was just set for exposure. So I do prefer having the depth of field on there as well, though. So I recommend turning that on for sure. Now, reverse display, if you want to flip the way the screen looks, you can turn that on and off here. Now, notice under camera mode, page 10, we actually have movie record settings. Now, these will appear in a different spot if I had the camera in movie mode, but in this mode, this is where the settings are. So you can change your ISO settings independent for video and photo, which is really cool. So if I go in here, I just wanted to show you the movie recording options. So here's the different options that we have, and I'll show you more movie settings when we go into movie mode. Now we got AF operation. This is where your autofocus settings are. All right, so here on page 2, this is where you can control how the autofocus system behaves. So auto will try to figure everything out for you, but these other modes here, it'll tell you like what they're good for. You know, for subjects that accelerate and decelerate quickly. Okay, high-speed moving subjects, you're probably going to want that one. Now we have an option here where it will change focus if something comes into the screen. You may or may not want that. This option won't change focus if something comes into the screen. It'll ignore those options. And this one is just a nice multi-purpose option as well. So like I said, I've been using auto pretty much, but if your autofocus is having a hard time, I would recommend going in here. Now, touch and drag AF settings, I wanted to show you that. I have it enabled, and I have it set to relative, and I have it set to right. Now, what this means is when you're using the viewfinder, so if I have my eye up to the viewfinder, now it's in viewfinder mode. See, the little TV up there is like on, and the right side of the screen is now a pad. So I could move the autofocus point around just by clicking and dragging my thumb around. That's going to move the autofocus point relative to what you're seeing on the EVF. That's what that feature is. It's referring to when using the viewfinder, how the screen will act as like a pad. And it's awesome. I highly recommend enabling that feature. Now in here you have some more playback options. This is where you can, rate your images, all sorts of stuff like that. You can actually process your images and do some work. Raw processing, creative assistant. You can resize, you can do red eye correction, which is quite nice. You can crop, you can also convert formats. Then you have a slideshow here. If you have this hooked up to a TV via the HDMI cable, for example, you can do a slideshow if you want, and things like that. Playback information, you can turn on highlight alert, so the highlights will like blink if they're blown out if you have that turned on. AF point, this is a cool option, I enabled it. This will show you when you're in playback where the camera was focused. And it's a good feature, especially if you're having a hard time with focus and you want to make sure that you nailed it on somebody's eye, for example. It'll just pop up where the focus was during the shot when viewing in playback. Now this is where all your Wi-Fi stuff is. This is where you can set that stuff up. And in here, you just have more configuration options. File numbering, for example. This is where you can format the memory card. Auto rotate, if you're shooting in vertical versus horizontal mode. Date and time, this is where you can set your date and time. And here is your language. Now here, if your frame rates are looking kind of weird, guys, that's probably because you're expecting the camera to be in the PAL format. If you're a European user, for example, your frame rates will be different. This is where you can change that. And if you change it to PAL, your frame rates, it'll switch from 24 and 30 to 25 frames per second, for example. So that's where that option is. You can change the size of the text for help, which is nice. If you have vision impaired, you can make it larger. Now the mode guide, you can turn that off. You remember how when I was changing the modes, how this pops up, this menu here? You can turn that off right here by going to disable. So now when I change the mode, it just changes modes. So it's nice having when when you're first new to the camera, but once you get used to it, I recommend disabling that. Now the beep, you may or may not want the beep on, but the beep can be quite annoying at times. So you might want to disable that there. Volume and power saving. Power saving is how long the camera will basically stay on before it automatically turns off. So by default, it turned off really quick, the screen dimmer, and it was driving me nuts. So I disabled that. The screen would go to like half brightness after like 10 seconds or something. So that's where you can change those settings. Now screen brightness, you can go in here and you can make the screen much brighter, which will make it way easier to see in daylight. And here on this page, you could reset the camera if you want to put it back to factory default. You got battery info and stuff like that. You can also see what the firmware is at on the camera. So if you need a firmware update and stuff like that, this is where you can go to check that. Now, if we keep going over, we have more advanced camera settings. We have exposure increments, for example, ISO increments you can change. Let's see, we got bracketing, auto cancel. You can turn that on and off. Bracketing sequence, number of shots for bracketing. So you could take bracketing and have 5 shots show up. The way I showed you earlier, it was only showing 3. You can also change your shutter speed range. You could set your aperture range. Very powerful. This is where you can control the dials, which dial does what. So you can change that if you're used to another camera system, for example. You might want that reversed. And then customizing buttons. This is where you can go in and control what some of the extra customizable buttons do. You can also have the camera set to take photos when there's a fully manual lens mounted. Right now that's turned off. So if you hook up a fully manual lens and you want the camera to fire, you're going to need to enable this option. And this is where you would clear all the custom functions, which is a nice one-stop shop to reset the camera. And then over here, all the way on the right, you have the My Menu area. And this is an awesome section. You can just go in here and the settings that you use most on the camera, you can just go in here and add them. So if I go to page 2 here, I got Add My Menu. So I can add a new tab, for example, because this tab's full. So if I go in here, I can add another tab, click OK, and then I can go into Configure and select items to register. So if I click that, now I can go in here and I can just scroll through the camera and whatever settings I need. If there's certain settings that I use sometimes, but they're deep in the menu and I can't remember where they are, you can just add them here. Like multiple exposure, for example. Let's go in there and add that. Okay, and now I'll hit menu to go back, hit menu to go back again, and now you can see I have on tab 2, multiple exposure. Just added that feature right there. So now if I switch the camera into video mode here, I just want to go into the menu and show you a few other things. Now, if I go into movie recording size, notice how I have 120 frames per second there. And that's because I have high frame rate mode on right here. So if I turn high frame rate mode off, if I go to disable, now high frame rate mode is off. So if I go back up here to movie record size, now you can see I have a ton of options. Here is where the 4K crop is. So that's 4K 60. If you guys want to take some 4K 60 video, that's where that option is. And they have a lower quality version right here. You can see on the right how it looks like it's squeezing the file a little bit, that little icon. So it's just a smaller format, and you can see up at the record time that it'll tell you that you can record for a longer period of time because the file is smaller. You can see it. You can get an hour here. Here you get almost 2 hours. So like I said, the go-to setting that I use most often is 4K 24. And that's what I tend to use most. But this is where all the other settings are, depending on your workflow and your needs. Most people, a lot of people these days are using 4K 30, which would be this option right there. Set OK. And again, like I said, you have to turn high frame rate mode on in order to use those other settings. Now, a weird thing is when you turn high frame rate mode on, it'll switch it to high frame rate mode. But when I turn it off, like if I go to disable, you see how it didn't go back to the 4K setting? So you have to actually change it back to 4K. So you got to go in there and I got to reselect the option that I want. And I got to do that every time. So that kind of sucks, but that's just the way that the camera is. And you need to be aware of that because if you do 120 recording, the 120 has no audio, by the way, also. But if you do some 120 recording and then you turn it off and you just assume it's going to go back to 4K and it's actually at HD 60, you know, that could mess you up. So keep that in mind, all right? And again, these are just movie-specific settings. You can see here, see how the ISO setting is now specific for video? And notice how there's not the 8 and the 9 on the menu. So it's pretty cool how the menus kind of cater depending on what mode you're in, but it can also really screw you up if you're looking for a setting and you don't realize you have to be in another camera mode. I have a bunch of videos and tutorials for this camera, guys. Like I said, I'll have that linked below. Custom white balance is one of them. So I show you how to set custom white balance in one of those videos I'll have linked below. It's really easy to do. And then, of course, you have these other features here. Now, high ISO noise reduction, I probably might want to turn that down a little bit. You guys can just play with that. And you have time-lapse movie, so you can enable that. Movie self-timer, pretty cool features, remote control. So if you like zebra settings, that will just overlay information on top of the screen so you can see exposure values. And it's a very powerful tool. And if you like using that, that's where that option is. So those are the basic fundamental concepts on how to use this camera. All right, so another cool feature of the Canon R10 or any of the newer Canon RF lenses is you can use this Canon RF to EF lens adapter. Now, with this adapter, the autofocus works, everything works, the EXIF data, all that stuff, and it's awesome. It pretty much works almost as good as a native lens, and this is very important because we don't have that many native lenses, especially the RFS lenses. So there are RF lenses to choose from, but they're very expensive, most of them. There are a couple options out there, like the 16mm f1.8, for example, but there's also all those EF lenses, and there's tons and tons of them out there. So for lens options, I do recommend checking out the EF lens line. And let me just show you a couple of sample photos from this killer 135mm f2 lens. I just took a couple snapshots. Let's check them out. Doing a really good job tracking his face. It's got like the little box on his face. Just did that by default. Let me zoom all the way in here. Now, I'm not using an ND filter, so the frames per second are not ideal. Probably looks pretty choppy. Good recovery.
One of the funnest trips we've had in a while.
Really? You like the pump track, huh?
Yeah, it's fun.
It's awesome, dude. What's your favorite part? The whoops?
No, the berms.
The berms? All right. Good times, buddy.
It's challenging.
It is challenging. buddy. There you go. Good kitty. Alright guys, I just wanted to go over a couple of higher ISO images so you can see the noise control. So starting at ISO 3200, this is raw quality, and this is where you start to see the noise a little bit on the shadow areas in particular, so I figured I would just start here. Below ISO 3200 is really good, but in the shadows you can see it just a little bit here. As a matter of fact, let me just go to 200% when we zoom in so you can see it a little bit better. So back here you can see in the shadow areas real quick. So here's what ISO 6400 looks like. Here's what ISO 12800 looks like. This is ISO 25000, doesn't look too bad, but when you zoom in, it gets pretty darn noisy. Let me put it back at 100% so you can see, you know, actually what it looks like. 200%, it just zooms in too much and it makes it look worse than it actually is. So here's ISO 32000. This is the max ISO for auto. And I would not go any higher than this. The camera is expandable up to 51,000, but there is no reason to go beyond this. Do you see how the banding here? So the high ISO ability is okay. It's pretty darn good. It's not quite as good as Sony though. Sony just still has a little bit of an edge, I would say, on the high ISO department. Alright guys, so after using the Canon R10 for like 3 weeks now, thoroughly, I've tried almost every feature on this thing and I've been using it diligently with both the kit lenses, and I can tell you the photography is amazing. It works really good. The color science on this camera is great. I really like the skin tones. The autofocus accuracy is really good, but again, it's not quite as good as Sony. Like the autofocus tracking ability, it works really well, don't get me wrong, but I could notice the hit rate isn't quite as good, particularly when I was taking pictures of Jace at the pump track. The hit rate, I would get 5-6 shots in a row sharp, then I would get 3 blurry, and then it would reacquire. So it's possible that the kit lenses just cannot keep up with the autofocus speed demand. But all I have is the kit lenses to use. So I don't want to judge the camera too harshly in that area because, well, number one, it did a great job, but I did notice it was slightly less good compared to the Sony a6400 or my a7C, for example, because the hit rate on the Sonys is just insane. It's like 95%. It's unbelievable. On the Canon, I would say it's 85% based on my testing with Jace. I'm not going to judge it too harshly because of the kit lenses. It might have just been that. So take that with a grain of salt. It still worked amazingly good. The color science, I was really impressed with. The skin tones and stuff were great. The landscape shots, the blues and the greens, it just looks really good. I mean, Canon's always been known for its colors, and I came from Canon. I used to have the Canon, well, I still have the Canon 5D Mark II. I really just like the ergonomics, the way that this feels in your hand. It feels so good. The grip is great. The shutter button feels good. Canon's always done a good job in that regard, and in my opinion, Sony has always lacked in the ergonomics. They're just not as good ergonomically. It's the difference between camera systems, right? You're gonna get a Sony, you're gonna get Canon, you're gonna get a Nikon or a Fuji. What are you gonna get? Well, it depends on what you want and need. So if ergonomics are super important, then you might be better off going with the Canon, or the Nikon or something. So the video quality I thought was pretty good overall. I did notice the noise reduction is a little bit heavy by default, but you can turn that down in the menu. And it's an 8-bit video camera by default unless you use that HDR PQ option. I'm only using the optical stabilization. I don't really like the digital stabilization because it crops in so much that it's just too tight. It ends up cropping in like this, But anyways, hand holding, this is how it looks. Alrighty, so now I'm recording with the gimbal. I actually switched it to auto mode just so it handles the exposure for me. So let me put it in selfie mode. Here's the kids on the couch. But you can just see how buttery smooth this footage is.
Hello.
Get some of the sky in there. And I just love using a gimbal. The footage looks so awesome. So you can't like shoot log footage on this camera. You kind of have to have it in one of the standard modes. Now, if you put it in neutral, the image will come out a little bit flatter, and then you can color correct and adjust a little bit in editing after the fact. But I just left it at default for this review. And like I said, the video footage at the lower ISOs was really good in my opinion. It did a good job overall. The optical stabilization on the lens worked well. So at the end of the day, guys, if you're a Canon fan and you're coming from Canon cameras and you just want to stick with the Canon system and it's time to go mirrorless, the R10 is a really good option for, you know, entry level, like, you know, for about $1,000. It's not exactly cheap, but compared to a $5,000 camera, it's cheap. So you can use your EF glass. So if you're coming from another Canon, like the Rebel system or whatever, and you want to go mirrorless, you can use your EF lenses on the R10, and it would be the next logical step. You know, like if you want to go mirrorless, you could move to the R10 or the R7, for example, or if you want to go full frame, you could hit up the R5. And then, like I said, you could use your EF glass with the adapter. So it's a nice migration, and you'll be familiar with the camera system because you're used to Canon. As far as the competition goes, of course, you have that Fuji S10, which looks really good. And then, of course, you have the Nikon Z50. I really do think the Canon R10 is a solid value for the dollar. The only limitation, really, that it stands out overwhelmingly would be the lens options that you have. And for video, it not having the log option is kind of a negative for video shooters. Beginner video shooters probably aren't going to use log anyway, but if you're starting to get into editing your own video footage, log does become important. It's kind of similar to shooting RAW for photos. It's similar in that way where you have to edit it after the fact. So I really hope you guys got what you were looking for. And if you want to see more content like this, you know, of course, hit that subscribe button. Maybe give me a thumbs up if you thought this video was good. And again, there's links below in the description area if you're looking for the other videos that I made on the R10. I also have some recommended accessories for the R10 if you're interested in that. And of course, all the gear that I use regularly, like my go-to gear, that's all linked below as well. All right, guys, I will catch up with you next time. Thanks again for watching my video, and have a great day, all right? Take care.